7 seconds of silence shattered 6 years of certainty when Ben Shapiro forced Adam Schiff to answer the one question no journalist ever did. In a hearing built on power, memory, and ruin, a black binder, a disgraced surveillance target, and a father broken by politics converged into one devastating moment that left Washington unable to hide from truth. 7 seconds of silence. 7 seconds that stretched so long inside that hearing room that it felt less like a pause and more like gravity itself had settled over the air. The microphones were on, the cameras were rolling. The stenographer's fingers hovered over her keyboard, and 28 million people across the country watched a man who had spoken confidently for 6 years suddenly discover that words, the very tool he had used to build his reputation, were no longer available to him. 7 seconds. That was how long Adam Schiff sat at the witness microphone after the question was asked. Not a complicated question, not a legal trap, not a rhetorical flourish. Just one sentence. Name one piece of evidence. 1. You are under oath. The man who asked the question was Ben Shapiro, 39 years old, Harvard Law trained, speaking at a speed so fast earlier in the hearing that the Senate stenographer had interrupted him 20 minutes before and asked him, politely but firmly, to slow down for the first time in her professional career. But when the moment finally came, when the binder closed and the question hung in the air, even Shapiro spoke slowly, because speed was no longer necessary. The evidence had already been placed on the table. 40 minutes earlier, the atmosphere inside the hearing room had been completely different. At that time, it had looked like Schiff was going to dominate the hearing the way he had dominated television screens for years. The room had been packed, every seat filled with staffers, reporters, aides, and spectators who had come to witness what everyone expected would be another predictable exchange in Washington politics. Fluorescent lights reflected off polished wood desks. Camera lenses pointed toward the witness table. Senators shuffled papers and adjusted microphones, while quiet conversations rippled through the gallery. When the chairman recognized him, Schiff did something unusual. He stood. Senators rarely stand during hearings. Most remain seated, speaking into the microphone with the quiet authority that comes from the office itself. But Schiff stood because standing communicated command. It projected control, and control was the currency that mattered most in rooms like this. "Mr. Chairman," he began. His voice carried across the chamber with practiced confidence, the confidence of a man who had delivered variations of the same argument so many times that repetition had gradually transformed the argument into something that sounded indistinguishable from fact. "I want to be very clear about what happened and why I did what I did." He paused briefly, letting the silence work for him rather than against him. "In 2016, a hostile foreign power interfered in our presidential election. That is not my opinion. That is the conclusion of every intelligence agency in the United States government. Russia interfered. That is a fact." Several heads in the gallery nodded immediately. Schiff continued, his tone steady. "As the ranking member and later chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, I had a constitutional duty to investigate that interference. I took that duty seriously. I would take it seriously again tomorrow and the day after that, because that is what patriots do." Applause broke out from the Democratic side of the gallery. Not hesitant applause, forceful applause. The kind meant to be heard clearly by the other half of the room. Schiff did not interrupt it. Instead, he allowed it to crest and fade, the way experienced politicians allow audiences to complete their emotional rhythm before continuing. The Mueller report documented over 170 contacts between individuals associated with the Trump campaign and Russian-linked operatives, 170. He repeated the number with careful emphasis. That is not nothing. That is not a hoax. That is a pattern of behavior that any responsible chairman would investigate. More applause followed. In the back row of the chamber, Schiff's chief of staff allowed himself a brief nod. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Schiff pressed forward. Mr. Shapiro is a podcast host. I respect his platform and his audience, but podcasts are not oversight, and opinions are not evidence. I had access to classified intelligence that Mr. Shapiro has never seen and will never see. The sentence landed with calculated authority. I made judgments based on that intelligence. I stand by those judgments. And history. Not a hearing room, not a podcast, not a Twitter feed. History will be the judge. He sat down. The applause was louder this time. The chairman struck the gavel twice before the room returned to order. In the third row of the gallery sat a man named Richard Kovach, 63 years old, a retired stamping plant worker from Youngstown, Ohio. Richard had driven 11 hours to be there. He had left his house at 3 in the morning, stopping only once for gasoline somewhere in Pennsylvania before continuing east toward Washington. By the time he reached the Hart Senate office building, he had just enough time to eat a gas station sandwich in his truck before walking into the security line. He wore the only suit he owned, the same suit he had worn 2 years earlier at his wife's funeral. The tie around his neck had been a Christmas gift from his son in 2016. The last Christmas they had spent together. Richard did not care about Senate procedure. He did not understand half the legal terminology being discussed in the hearing room. He had come because of something that happened 3 years earlier on Thanksgiving. His son David had looked across the dinner table, hands shaking with anger, and said words that Richard still heard every night when he closed his eyes. "You support a man who sold this country to Vladimir Putin. I can't sit at this table anymore." David had stood up, walked past the kitchen doorway, grabbed his coat, and left the house where he had grown up. He walked past the garage where Richard had taught him how to change a tire. Past the mailbox they had painted together when David was 9 years old. Then he got in his car and drove away. That was November 2019. They had not spoken since. Richard watched Schiff sit down to applause and felt something tighten inside his chest. Not anger, something older, something closer to grief. Because the man the gallery was applauding was the same man his son had believed. Night after night on television. MSNBC after MSNBC. Interview after interview. The evidence is there. The evidence is direct. The evidence is in plain sight. Richard had heard those phrases so many times that they echoed in his memory like a recording. His son had believed every word, and those words had cost Richard his son. The chairman turned toward the witness table. "Mr. Shapiro," he said, "you may proceed." Ben Shapiro did not stand. He did not need to. Instead, he opened a thick black binder on the table in front of him. The binder was so large that it could easily have been mistaken for a telephone directory. He flipped to the first tabbed section. Then he looked directly at Adam Schiff. The expression on his face was not anger, not excitement, something colder. The expression of a lawyer who had spent months preparing a cross-examination and intended to use every second of it. "Senator Schiff," Shapiro said calmly. "Are you done?" Schiff blinked once, slightly surprised by the question. "Yes," he replied. Shapiro nodded. "Good," he said quietly, "because I brought receipts." The room did not react immediately when Ben Shapiro said those 3 words, because Washington had heard that phrase before. Politicians claimed receipts all the time. Commentators promised documents that never appeared. Staffers waved folders for cameras that contained nothing more than talking points and rehearsed accusations. But this binder was different. Shapiro did not hold it up for effect. He did not tap it dramatically against the desk. He simply opened it, flipped to the first tabbed page, and began reading. No commentary, no speculation, just words. Words spoken by the man sitting 12 feet across from him. March 20th, 2017, Shapiro said, his voice steady and precise. He looked down at the page. NBC News, meet the press. Senator Schiff told Chuck Todd, and I quote, "I don't want to go into specifics, but I will say that there is evidence that is not circumstantial." End quote. He turned the page. The sound of paper sliding against paper echoed softly through the hearing room. February 14th, 2018, CNN. Senator Schiff told Wolf Blitzer, "There is direct evidence, I think, of collusion." End quote. Another page turned. March 4th, 2019, CBS News. Senator Schiff stated, "I think there is plenty of evidence of collusion or conspiracy in plain sight." End quote. Another page. August 22nd, 2019, MSNBC. After the Mueller report had already been released, after it had already concluded there was no criminal conspiracy, Senator Schiff told the American people, "There is ample evidence of collusion in plain sight." End quote. The pages continued turning, each quote delivered in the same calm cadence, each date, each network, each statement placed into the hearing record with the precision of a legal transcript. By the 5th page, the room had grown noticeably quieter. By the 10th page, the quiet had become something else, because the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Shapiro finally stopped turning pages. He closed the binder halfway, resting his hand on it. "Senator," he said, looking directly at Schiff, "my staff spent 11 weeks compiling every public statement you made regarding evidence of Russian collusion between March 2017 and June 2023. He paused. Television interviews, press conferences, podcast appearances, floor speeches, social media posts. Another pause. We counted every one. He tapped the binder once. The total was 447. The number did not explode into the room. It settled there slowly, the way numbers sometimes do when they are too large to process immediately. 447. Shapiro repeated it, this time more slowly. 447 times across 31 networks. Over 6 years, you told the American people that you had seen evidence. And he leaned slightly forward. Direct evidence. He repeated the phrase with deliberate emphasis. Not circumstantial. Another pause. In plain sight. No one in the gallery moved. Not once, Shapiro continued, in 447 appearances did a single interviewer ask you to produce that evidence. He let the sentence finish without interruption. Not one journalist said, "Senator, you say you have direct evidence. Show us." Shapiro closed the binder completely. They believed you. His voice remained calm. Because you were the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. He leaned back slightly in his chair. And chairmen are not supposed to lie about classified intelligence. The sentence hung in the air. Then Shapiro leaned forward again, and the tempo changed. "I am asking you now," he said slowly, "under oath, in front of this committee and the American people." He stopped. The silence was deliberate. "Senator Schiff, where is the evidence?" Schiff shifted slightly in his chair. "The evidence was in the public record," he replied. "The 170 contacts I mentioned. The Trump Tower meeting. The sharing of polling data with..." Shapiro raised his hand. not abruptly, but firmly enough that the interruption was unmistakable. "Senator," he said, "I did not ask about contacts." His voice was still calm, but the precision had sharpened. "I did not ask about meetings." He leaned closer to the microphone. "I did not ask about concerning behavior or patterns that warranted investigation." Shapiro's eyes did not leave Schiff's face. "You did not tell the American people there were contacts worth investigating." He paused. "You told them there was direct evidence of criminal conspiracy." Another pause. "Your word, direct." Another pause. "Your word, criminal." Another pause. "Your word, conspiracy." The room was silent now, completely silent. "Name one piece," Shapiro said. "One." His voice dropped slightly lower. "Not a meeting that might look bad. Not an email that could be interpreted two ways. Not a conversation that raised questions." He leaned forward until his hands rested flat on the desk. "One piece of direct evidence that the Trump campaign criminally conspired with the Russian government." Then he finished the sentence. "You said you had it. You said it was not circumstantial. You are under oath, Senator." He stopped speaking. "One piece." And that was when the silence began. Not the casual silence of a pause between speakers. Not the procedural silence of someone waiting to reclaim their time. The other kind. The kind that presses against your ears. The kind that forces you to become aware of every sound in the room. The faint electrical hum of television cameras. The whisper of the ventilation system overhead. The soft rustle of a reporter shifting in their chair. Adam Schiff did not speak. 3 seconds passed. 5 seconds passed. 7 seconds. In a hearing room, 7 seconds is an eternity. A pen rolled across a desk somewhere in the press section. Someone shifted in their seat. Another person cleared their throat quietly. But Schiff said nothing. The microphone sat 12 inches from his face. 28 million people were watching, and the man who had spoken 447 times about evidence suddenly had no words. Shapiro nodded once, not in celebration, in confirmation. "Let the record reflect," he said quietly, "that the senator has been given the opportunity to produce the evidence he claimed to possess for 6 years." He glanced down briefly. "And has produced nothing." He lifted his eyes again, not because he chose not to. A pause. "But because there is nothing to produce." He spoke the next sentence gently. "The evidence was never there." The words landed softly, but they landed. "It was never there, Senator," Shapiro continued, "and you knew it. Because the witnesses had told you." Shapiro reopened the binder and flipped to a different section. "The House Intelligence Committee," he said, "your committee, conducted closed-door depositions with senior officials from the Obama administration. These were the people who would know. The people who had access to the most sensitive intelligence in the United States government. The directors, the deputies, the advisors, the people who briefed the President of the United States every morning." He lifted a document from the binder. "You were present for those depositions. You asked the questions. You heard the answers. And because the transcripts were classified," he paused, "the witnesses could not tell the public what they had said." Shapiro held up the paper. "But I can." He read the first name. "Former Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper." Shapiro read the deposition answer. Asked under oath whether he had seen direct evidence of a conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia. He looked down. The answer was one word. He looked up again. No. He turned the page. Former Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates. Same question, same answer. No, another page. Former National Security Advisor Susan Rice. No, another page. Former Attorney General Loretta Lynch. No, another page. Former FBI Director James Comey. No. Shapiro placed the pages back on the desk. 5 names. 5 depositions. 5 people who had held the highest intelligence and law enforcement positions in the country. 5 people who had access to every classified briefing. 5 people who had every institutional reason to say yes. And 5 people who, under oath, behind closed doors, with no cameras and no audience, said the same word. No. Shapiro's voice was steady. You sat in the room for every one of those depositions, Senator. You heard Director Clapper say no. You heard Deputy Attorney General Yates say no. You heard Advisor Rice say no. You heard Attorney General Lynch say no. You heard Director Comey say no. He leaned forward again. And the next morning, another pause. You went on television. CNN, MSNBC, NBC. And you told the American people that you had seen direct evidence of collusion. He did not raise his voice. You heard the truth in private. And you told the opposite in public. Shapiro let the sentence settle. And because the transcripts were classified, he paused. No one could contradict you. The witnesses could not come forward. They could not say, that is not what I told him. They were bound by classification. Shapiro looked directly at Schiff. But you were not. You were bound only by your oath. And the room remained silent. The silence that followed Shapiro's last sentence did not break immediately. No senator interrupted. No aide whispered loudly enough to be heard. Even the reporters in the press row, normally eager to type the next line before it was spoken, sat motionless for several seconds, as if they understood that the moment unfolding in front of them required patience rather than speed. Ben Shapiro turned another page in the binder. The motion was slow, deliberate, the careful movement of a lawyer presenting the next exhibit in a case that had taken years to build. Mr. Chairman, he said evenly, I would like to call the next witness. The name he spoke meant little to many people watching the hearing for the first time. But for those who had followed the Russia investigation from the beginning, the name carried weight. I call Carter Page. A tall man in a gray suit stood from the second row behind the witness table. He walked forward with the quiet composure of someone who had spent years being discussed on television without ever being allowed to speak for himself. His posture was slightly stiff, not from arrogance, but from the habit of caution developed by people who know that every gesture will be examined and misinterpreted. When he reached the witness chair, he adjusted the microphone and sat down. My name is Carter Page, he began calmly. I am a graduate of the United States Naval Academy, class of 1993. His voice carried a steady tone that came from long practice explaining the same story over and over again. I served my country as a naval intelligence officer. He paused briefly. In 2013, I assisted the FBI in building a case against a Russian spy ring operating in New York. The sentence hung in the room longer than expected. I helped my government identify and prosecute actual Russian agents. He drew a breath. In 2016, I volunteered, unpaid, as a foreign policy advisor to the Trump campaign. His eyes moved briefly across the committee table. I attended one meeting. I delivered one speech in Moscow. That speech was reported to the campaign in advance. He stopped for a moment, as if measuring the distance between the life he once had and the events that followed. For that, Page continued quietly, the FBI obtained a surveillance warrant against me under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. He spoke the words without drama. They monitored my communications, my emails, my phone calls, my movements. For more than 2 years, no one interrupted. I was never charged with a crime. I was never indicted. I was never even interviewed by the Mueller investigation as a suspect. Page's voice lowered slightly. After 2 years of the most invasive surveillance authority the United States government can use against its own citizens, they found nothing. He looked down briefly. Because there was nothing to find. The stillness inside the hearing room deepened. But by then, Page said slowly, it did not matter. His voice changed, not louder, but thinner. The sound of someone speaking about damage that cannot be repaired. I lost my career. He clasped his hands together on the table. I had built a consulting business over 15 years. It disappeared within months. No one hires a man the New York Times has described as a Russian agent. He swallowed once. I lost my savings. Legal fees consumed everything. He lifted his eyes again. I lost friends who decided it was safer not to return my calls than to remain associated with someone accused of being compromised by a foreign government. The next sentence arrived quietly. My mother is 78 years old. She lives alone in a small town in Minnesota. Page paused. Reporters called her house 20, sometimes 30 times a day. They knocked on her door. They waited in her driveway. They asked her whether her son was a traitor. He stopped speaking. For several seconds, no one in the room moved. She stopped answering the phone. She stopped opening the door. A 78-year-old woman afraid to pick up her own telephone. Page turned slightly toward the committee. I served my country in uniform. I helped the FBI catch actual Russian spies. And then my own government turned its surveillance apparatus on me. He took another breath. Based on a warrant supported by a dossier funded by a political campaign. The name of the document did not need explanation. The Steele dossier, Page continued, a document compiled by a former British intelligence officer, paid for by the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee. A document that relied heavily on statements from a Russian national who later admitted many of his claims were speculation. Page finally looked directly toward Adam Schiff. And during that time, he said quietly, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee went on television repeatedly and suggested that I might be a Russian agent. The sentence did not accuse. It simply stated, everything was not fine, Senator. Shapiro allowed the testimony to settle before speaking again. Mr. Chairman, he said, I would like to enter into the record the findings of the Department of Justice Inspector General. He lifted another document, December 2019. The report of Inspector General Michael Horowitz. Shapiro read slowly. The Inspector General reviewed the FISA applications used to obtain surveillance authority against Carter Page. He paused. The review found 17 significant errors and omissions. The number landed sharply. 17. Among those errors, Shapiro continued, the FBI failed to disclose to the FISA court that the primary source of the dossier had been funded by a political campaign. They failed to disclose that Christopher Steele had been terminated as a confidential source after unauthorized media contacts. They failed to disclose exculpatory information about Mr. Page's relationship with American intelligence agencies. Shapiro turned another page. And an FBI attorney named Kevin Kleinsmith later pleaded guilty to falsifying an email used in the warrant process. The document rested on the desk between them. Kleinsmith altered a CIA communication in order to hide the fact that Carter Page had previously assisted U.S. intelligence. The hearing room remained silent. Shapiro spoke again. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court issued a rare public rebuke. He read from the statement. The court concluded that the FBI had misled the court. He looked up. Misled. He allowed the word to linger. That is judicial language for lied. The senators sitting along the dais shifted slightly in their chairs. Senator Schiff, Shapiro continued, your February 2018 memo stated the following. He read the sentence exactly. FBI and DOJ officials did not abuse the FISA process, omit material information, or subvert this vital tool. Shapiro closed the document. Every part of that statement has now been proven false. The FBI abused the process. They omitted material information 17 times, and an FBI lawyer admitted in federal court to falsifying evidence. He gestured toward Carter Page. Mr. Page lost his career, his savings, his reputation, his mother's peace of mind, all based on a narrative that your own witnesses had already told you was unsupported by evidence. Page stood quietly and returned to his seat. The room watched him walk away. Ben Shapiro reached under the table and lifted a tablet. Mr. Chairman, he said, I would like to play a video for the record. He tapped the screen. The speakers in the hearing room filled with a familiar voice. Adam Schiff's voice. The recording came from the September 2019 impeachment hearing. Schiff's voice echoed across the chamber. I have a favor I want from you, though. Shapiro stopped the video before it continued. That recording, he said calmly, was presented by Senator Schiff as a summary of President Trump's phone call with the President of Ukraine. He held up 2 printed pages. In my left hand is the official transcript of the call released by the White House. In my right hand is the transcript of what Senator Schiff read to Congress. He glanced on Fune. The President's actual words were, I would like you to do us a favor, though. Shapiro lifted the other page. Senator Schiff's version included the phrase, I want you to make up dirt on my political opponent. He looked back at the committee. Those words do not appear in the transcript. Not once, not anywhere. He lowered the papers slowly. When Representative Mike Turner challenged Senator Schiff about this discrepancy, Senator Schiff responded that his reading was meant to be, quote, at least part in parody. The word hung in the air. Parody. Shapiro spoke carefully. The chairman of the House Intelligence Committee during an impeachment proceeding presented a fictional version of a presidential phone call before the American public. He paused and called it parody after he was challenged. The hearing room had grown so quiet that the faint hum of the lights overhead could be heard. Shapiro returned the tablet to the table. And that, he said calmly, was not the first time fiction had been entered into the congressional record. Shapiro did not raise his voice when he said it. He did not slam the binder closed. He did not gesture toward the cameras, and he did not look toward the gallery for approval. Instead, he simply turned another page, the quiet sound of paper sliding beneath his fingers echoing softly in the room that had grown unnaturally still. On March 20th, 2017, he continued, Senator Schiff stood on the floor of the United States House of Representatives and read from a document that would later become one of the most controversial intelligence reports in modern political history. He paused. The Steele dossier. The name itself carried the weight of years of argument, investigation, and political division. The document compiled by former British intelligence officer Christopher Steele had once circulated through Washington like a secret everyone pretended not to know about, whispered between journalists, intelligence officials, and campaign operatives before eventually finding its way into the bloodstream of national politics. Shapiro lifted a printed sheet from the binder. The Steele dossier was funded by the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee through the law firm Perkins Coie and the research firm Fusion GPS. He spoke the sentence carefully, allowing every part of the chain to settle into the record. Its primary subsource was a Russian national named Igor Danchenko. Shapiro glanced down at the next paragraph. Mr. Danchenko later told the FBI that many of the claims attributed to him were based on rumor, speculation, and conversations he had heard in passing. He looked up again. Conversations over drinks. The phrase drifted across the hearing room with quiet finality. And yet, 3 specific claims from that document were read by Senator Schiff into the permanent congressional record. Shapiro lifted 3 fingers slightly above the table. Claim 1, that Donald Trump's personal attorney, Michael Cohen, traveled to Prague to coordinate election interference with Russian operatives. He lowered 1 finger. The Mueller investigation confirmed that Michael Cohen never traveled to Prague. Records showed he was in California at the time. Another finger lowered. Claim 2, that Russia had cultivated Donald Trump as a strategic asset for at least 5 years. Another pause. Neither the Mueller investigation nor the subsequent Durham investigation uncovered evidence supporting that claim. The third finger lowered. Claim 3, that a well-developed conspiracy of cooperation existed between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. Shapiro leaned slightly closer to the microphone. The dossier's primary source later acknowledged that he had no evidence supporting that claim. He closed the binder again. 3 claims, all false, all entered into the congressional record of the United States. The room remained silent. And those claims, Shapiro continued calmly, now exist permanently in the official archive of this country beside documents like the Gettysburg Address and the Declaration of Independence. He paused long enough for the comparison to land. Fabrications sourced from rumor, funded by a political campaign, entered into the permanent record by the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. Shapiro allowed the silence to stretch before continuing. And when the Durham investigation concluded that the FBI had been warned repeatedly about the unreliability of that document, he looked briefly toward Schiff. You called the report flawed. You called the investigation a bust. The binder rested motionless beneath his hand. The Inspector General was wrong. The special counsel was wrong. The witnesses were wrong. Everyone was wrong. Shapiro tilted his head slightly. Everyone except you. For the first time since the hearing began, Adam Schiff leaned forward. His attorney placed a hand lightly on his arm. Schiff shook it off. Mr. Chairman, he said. His voice had changed. The polished cadence he had used earlier was gone, replaced by something sharper and more immediate. I would like to respond. The chairman glanced toward Shapiro. Shapiro nodded once. Senator Schiff, you may respond. Schiff turned toward Shapiro, the expression on his face no longer the controlled composure of a politician delivering a prepared statement, but the hard focus of someone who had spent decades in political combat. Mr. Shapiro, he said evenly, let me ask you something. His tone carried an edge now. You co-founded a media company called The Daily Wire. The company is valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. It produces podcasts, films, children's programming, and political commentary. He leaned forward slightly. And every time my name appears in your content, Your engagement metrics spike. A ripple moved through the gallery. You know exactly how much revenue controversy generates for your business. Schiff's eyes stayed fixed on Shapiro. So, let me ask you directly. His voice hardened. Are you here today for accountability? He paused. Or are you here for content? Applause broke out from the Democratic side of the gallery. Some laughter followed, sharp and approving. For a brief moment, the balance of the room shifted. Ben Shapiro did not respond immediately. His hands rested on the binder. 3 seconds passed. 4. The cameras zoomed slightly closer. Shapiro inhaled slowly. Then he nodded once. "Senator," he said calmly, "that is a fair question." The room quieted instantly. "Yes," he continued. "My company is successful. Yes, political commentary generates engagement. And yes, your name generates views." He folded his hands together. "All of that is true." He paused. "And none of it changes a single fact presented here today." Shapiro leaned forward. "But since you asked, let me explain the difference between you and me." His voice remained measured. "When I am wrong, I say I am wrong. In 2016, I said publicly that I would not vote for Donald Trump. I lost audience members. I lost advertisers. I lost money." He shrugged slightly. "I said it anyway because I believed it." He continued. "Later, I changed my position. I said that publicly as well. I was criticized by people who had supported my earlier position. I accepted that criticism." He looked directly at Schiff. "That is what happens when you follow evidence instead of narrative." Shapiro paused again. "I have been wrong before. I have said so publicly." He leaned closer to the microphone. "So let me ask you a simple question. One time, just one. Can you name a single moment in the last 6 years when you admitted you were wrong about Russian collusion?" Schiff opened his mouth, closed it. The silence returned. Shapiro nodded slightly. "That is what I thought." He rested his hands on the table. "You asked whether I am here for accountability or content. The answer is simple. I am here because someone needed to ask the question that 447 interviewers never asked." He gestured briefly toward Carter Page. "I am here because a man sitting behind me lost his career and his savings after being surveilled under a warrant that your memo claimed was legitimate. I am here because $32 million of taxpayer money was spent investigating a conspiracy that multiple witnesses told you did not exist." He paused. "And yes, Senator, my company will publish this hearing. Millions of people will watch it. That is how media works. You spent 6 years using CNN and MSNBC to tell your version of the story." Shapiro lifted the binder slightly. "The difference is that my version includes the evidence." He set the binder down. "The evidence yours did not." The gallery did not applaud. Instead, something else happened. The room went completely silent. Not the uneasy silence of tension. The deeper silence that comes when everyone present understands that the balance of the argument has shifted. Adam Schiff sat back in his chair. His attorney leaned toward him and whispered something quietly. Several cameras caught the movement of the attorney's lips. "Do you want to end this?" Schiff shook his head. Not because he wanted to continue, because leaving would have been worse. Ben Shapiro closed the binder for the final time. "On June 21, 2023, he said, the United States House of Representatives voted to censure Adam Schiff. The vote was 213 to 209. The resolution stated that Representative Schiff purposely deceived his committee, Congress, and the American people. He allowed the phrase to settle. Purposely deceived. Those words are now part of the permanent record of the United States Congress. Shapiro looked directly at Schiff one last time. Senator, facts do not care about your career. They do not care about committee assignments. They do not care about television bookings or fundraising emails. Facts are patient. They wait. They waited through 2 years of Mueller. They waited through 3 years of Durham. They waited through 447 interviews. He rested both hands flat on the desk. And they are still here. In these transcripts. In these depositions. In this room. The evidence was never there. He paused. And you knew it. The chairman cleared his throat. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel struck, and the room finally began to move again.